And for more on this, I spoke with Ottawa-based criminal defense lawyer Michael Spratt earlier. Michael, thank you so much for being here today. On Monday, you said pre-trial detention is punishment of the worst kind. Can you explain to our audience why you said that?
Well, there's, I think, two main reasons why that's the case. The first is sort of the technical legal reason. It's punishment before someone has been convicted or found guilty of any offense. And, our constitutional principles say people are entitled to reasonable bail, they're presumed innocent, and generally we shouldn't be punishing someone before they've been found guilty. But the more practical reason, and the reason that should be disturbing for every Canadian, is that our conditions in pretrial detention are Dickensian. They're horrendous. They're conditions you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. We're talking about violence, isolation, disease. It is truly the worst way that we could treat members of our society, and it's something that we should be deeply, deeply ashamed of. And there's so many examples of just the inhumanity that exists behind bars in Canada.
Now, Michael, can you tell us how marginalized groups and people that are innocent until they're proven guilty are ultimately going to be the ones impacted by these changes?
Well, we know from just looking at the cold numbers that marginalized groups, Indigenous people, non-white Canadians, people with mental health issues, people with addiction issues, these are the people who are disproportionately filling our jails. And there's a number of reasons for that. We can look at the systemic racism and bias that we have in the system. We can look at sort of the colonial system that we've developed in the first place. But at a practical level, there is an advantage that you have when you are rich and privileged. When you are seeking bail, if you have money, if you have resources, if you have family connections, you can have people take time off of work to come to court to bail you out. You have the funds available to arrange private treatment or private counseling, and you have a life history that might be filled with clubs and activities and volunteer work and private schools, sort of the trappings of privilege that some people in our society have. On the other hand, if you're, a working Canadian, someone who, whose family can't take time off work to come over and over to court and experience those delays and miss their employment, if you haven't had that same privilege in your background, it can be harder to obtain bail, especially since behind bars, there is very little treatment. There is very little counseling. You are being warehoused. And so if you have the money and the resources and the influence to navigate the complicated rehabilitation system and arrange things privately that, the government doesn't see fit to provide to even those who are behind bars, it just makes it easier to obtain bail in the first place.
Well, the federal government says there's concerns of public safety and rising crime, which is why it's pushing these changes. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we need to take a step back and say, are those underlying facts true? There certainly has been widely reported incidents of tragedy, police officers being killed on the job, violence that we see in the communities. But when we take a step back and we look not just at isolated incidents and we look at sort of longer term trends, the incidence of officers being killed on duty is exactly the same. It's unchanged. There isn't an increase in these types of incidents. If we look at sort of violence in our communities, there might be a recent spike in some of that violence, but the long-term crime trends show that we have never actually been safer as a community. And if you actually want to look at the very short-term crime trends, we actually see some gun-related violence going down in some major centers. So we have to be really careful about how we play with the data, and we have to make sure that we do it from an intellectually honest starting point and not a point of posturing for political gain. So I think we have to say, are things becoming dangerous? And I think that there is a debate to be had there. At the same time, we can all agree that one needless death, one instance of violence is one too many. So then we have to look at, do the policy changes that some are pushing, reverse onus bail provisions for violent offenses, or being tougher on bail, detaining more people, is that actually going to help community safety? And again, the evidence says no. when you detain someone in conditions that are inhumane, where they're sleeping on a cold floor of their jail cell, when they're forced to give birth in their cell, as has happened here in Ottawa, when they are subject to violence from correctional authorities, as we see across from the province, when they're put in solitary confinement because of mental health issues, when they're denied access to their family, when they lose their employment, when they lose their housing, when they are denied treatment at all, when they're just warehoused, people actually come out in a worse place than they were when they went in. And that can lead, and it does lead, to an increase in recidivism rates, and it actually decreases public safety. So we can look at isolated examples where there may be tragedy, because no system is perfect. But at the same time, we need to take a step back and make sure we're dealing with reality. And also, we need to look at the consequences of sort of these tough on crime measures.
Well, Michael, certainly plenty to think about. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime.